Plate Motion Unit, Lesson 1.3, Exploring Earth's Plates. Activity 3, Analyzing Maps. Here's what your student screen looks like for this part of the lesson. Let's discuss our ideas about patterns. What do you know about patterns? What are some examples of patterns? Observing patterns is an important practice in geology. Geologists use maps to look for patterns in what happens on Earth's outer layer, such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. They also look for patterns in the types and numbers of landforms found on the outer layer, such as mountain ranges and canyons. When geologists notice a pattern in where or how something formed in the outer layer, they know that a similar geologic process could be happening in each of those places. Vocabulary. Pattern. Something we observe to be similar over and over again. Students, remember to look at the glossary if you need more support. In this activity, you'll use a transparency to gather information from two maps to look for patterns. Let's look at one of the maps we'll be using. Information from these maps will help you learn more about what the land is like underneath the Earth's surface. Plate boundary map. Earth's outer layer is made of hard, solid rock and is divided into plates. Notice Area A, Area B, Area C, and Area D. Notice these important features on the map. The title and subheading. Familiar items on the map, such as continents and the ocean. The key and symbol, the red line showing plate boundaries, and how it helps you understand what the map shows. Consider the overall map and what it represents. This is a map that shows how the solid rock of the Earth's outer layer is divided into plates. Note that 4 unique areas are labeled on the map. These 4 areas are designated by boxes for this activity. The boxes do not represent plates or anything that is actually found on Earth. We know from the title of this map that it shows plate boundaries. Based on what you see on this map and what you already know, what do you think a plate boundary is? You might respond, a place where 2 plates meet. Here's what your student screen looks like for this part of the lesson. Vocabulary. Plate boundary. The place where 2 plates meet. Remember to look at the glossary if you need more support. Using transparencies will help you collect evidence about what happens at plate boundaries in the 4 labeled areas on the map. You will look carefully at the areas where the plates meet and record data from those areas. You will then place your transparency over a different map to gather evidence about what happens where plates meet. In part 1 of this activity, you'll gather evidence about what happens where plates meet. You will use these materials and investigate in pairs. Students, for the first part of the hands-on activity, you would need 1 transparency and 1 red wet erase marker for each student, as well as 1 plate boundary map for each pair of students to share. Since we are not in class, you won't be able to do this part of the lesson. You would be sharing a plate boundary map with your partner and take turns using it. Do not write on the plate boundary map and only write on the transparency. Here is what your student screen looks like for this part of the lesson. Transparency Activity Part 1, Plate Boundary Map. Align the transparency, define the areas, and trace plate boundaries. Students, you will not be able to do this part of the lesson at home. This is where you would draw the plate boundaries in each of the 4 areas on the transparencies. Our second map would show earthquake data. What is an earthquake? What happens during an earthquake? You might respond, a sudden shaking of Earth's surface. You might also respond, the ground shakes. Sometimes there's damage to buildings or roads. Here's what your student screen looks like for this part of the lesson. Vocabulary. Earthquake. A sudden shaking of Earth's surface. Remember to look at the glossary if you need more support. In part 2 of this activity, you'll gather evidence about the 4 areas by overlaying them on a world map that shows where earthquakes occurred between 1960 and 1990. Earthquake map. The ground shaking that happens during an earthquake tells us something about Earth's outer layer. The shaking is evidence that Earth's outer layer can move. Next, you will use your transparency to see if there are global patterns associated with where earthquakes occur on Earth's outer layer. Students, for the second part of the hands-on activity, you would need one black wet erase marker for each student and one earthquake map for each pair of students to share. Since you are not in class, you won't be able to do this part of the lesson. Here's what your student screen looks like for this part of the lesson. Transparency Activity Part 2, Earthquake Map. Align transparency, observe and discuss, trace plate boundaries. Students, you may not be able to do this part of the lesson at home. What do you notice about where earthquakes occur in relation to plate boundaries? Does there seem to be a pattern or connection between the locations of plate boundaries and earthquakes? Does this pattern exist in one area or in all four areas? What can this tell us about plate boundaries and earthquakes on the entire planet? Notice that earthquakes most often occur along plate boundaries in the four areas. We are using patterns as part of our evidence. Plate boundary and earthquake map. Earth's outer layer is made of hard, solid rock and is divided into plates. This map contains the same data as your transparencies, the earthquake data overlaid on the plate boundary map. Notice that earthquakes occur most often on plate boundaries. Why do you think this pattern of earthquakes exists? What do you think it can tell us about the plates that make up Earth's outer layer? Earthquakes are evidence of movement and the pattern of this movement happening at plate boundaries. This may prompt you to begin thinking about whether or how Earth's plates move. Key concept: patterns. Geologists look for patterns in landforms and in geologic events in order to better understand Earth. Geologists look for patterns in Earth's outer layer. They look for patterns in geologic events such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. They also look for patterns in landforms on the outer layer, such as mountain ranges and valleys. These patterns allow geologists to better understand Earth. Scientists look for patterns in all areas of science. Patterns can serve as evidence to explain something observed in the natural world. End of activity. Be sure to complete all your work in Amplify for this activity before moving on.